There is something happening in the Middle East right now that the mainstream press is covering with the wrong lens entirely. And if you only read the headlines, you are going to walk away with precisely the wrong conclusion. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar are quietly but unmistakably signaling support for Iran at a moment when Washington is beating the war drums louder than it has in years. And the question you should be asking is not why are they siding with Iran? The real question is, what does it tell us about the collapsing architecture of American influence in a region that Washington spent trillions of dollars and decades of military presence trying to control? Because what we are witnessing is not a diplomatic anomaly, it is not a temporary alignment of convenience. It is the visible surface of a tectonic shift that has been building underneath the sands of the Arabian Peninsula for years. And the critical realization I want you to hold in your mind right now, one that I will fully unpack toward the end of this, is that this is not about Iran at all. Iran is the occasion. The story is about something far larger, far older, and far more consequential for every American sitting at home wondering why the world seems to be reorganizing itself against us. Let us start with what actually happened, because the details matter more than the framing the news gives you. As the United States has escalated its pressure campaign against Tehran, done through sanctions, through military posturing in the Persian Gulf, through the kind of rhetoric that historically precedes military action, the three most powerful Arab states in the Gulf have chosen a notably different path. Saudi Arabia, which for decades was considered Washington's most reliable Arab partner, has not only refused to join the pressure coalition, but has actively maintained and even deepened its diplomatic ties with Iran following the Chinese-brokered normalization agreement of 2023. The UAE, which hosts American military assets and is woven deeply into the fabric of Western financial architecture, has continued expanding economic corridors with Tehran. And Qatar, home to the largest American airbase in the entire Middle East, has played the role of quiet but consistent diplomatic buffer, refusing to be weaponized against its Persian neighbor across the Gulf. Now, if you grew up on the standard Western narrative about the Middle East, this probably makes your head spin. Because the story we were always told was simple. Arab states fear Iran, Israel fears Iran, and America protects the Arabs from Iran. That triangle was the foundation of American strategic logic in the region for 40 years. It justified the arms deals, the military bases, the foreign aid, and the endless diplomatic energy that Washington poured into maintaining what it called regional stability, DABO, which was really just another way of saying American primacy. But to understand why that triangle has now collapsed, we have to go back and examine what it was actually built on, because it was never as solid as Washington believed. The Arab-Persian divide is real, the Sunni-Shia tension is real. Saudi Arabia and Iran genuinely competed for regional dominance for decades, and that competition was exploited masterfully by Western powers who understood that a divided Middle East is a controllable Middle East. Henry Kissinger understood this. The architects of post-Cold War American foreign policy understood this. You keep the Arabs nervous about Iran, you keep Iran isolated, and you position America as the indispensable guarantor of Gulf security. In exchange, you get military basing rights, oil priced in dollars, weapons contracts worth hundreds of billions, and a permanent American footprint in the most strategically significant real estate on the planet. It was an elegant arrangement for Washington. But here is where the story gets interesting, because no arrangement built on manufactured fear lasts forever. At some point, the nations being managed start doing their own strategic calculus. And what the Gulf states have collectively realized over the past several years is something that should make every thoughtful American deeply uncomfortable. The United States is no longer a reliable security guarantor. This is the ground-level reality that the mainstream press almost never states plainly. Think about what the Gulf states actually observed in recent years. They watched Washington fumble the withdrawal from Afghanistan in a way that signaled profound strategic incompetence to every government in the world that had been betting on American staying power. They watched a years-long war in Ukraine consume American political attention and military stockpiles, while Gulf concerns about regional security were treated as secondary. They watched as Washington repeatedly demonstrated that it viewed Gulf partnerships primarily as transactional, useful when convenient, expendable when politically costly back home. And perhaps most tellingly, they watched Israel conduct operations across the broader region with American diplomatic cover, while the Gulf states were expected to absorb the political costs of that association domestically. Saudi Arabia in particular faces a population that is deeply sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, for Mohammed bin Salman, being seen as Washington's instrument at a time when American-backed military operations are generating catastrophic humanitarian imagery across the Arab world is not a manageable political position. It is a destabilizing one. So ask yourself this: if you were a Gulf leader watching all of this unfold, would you continue to bet your country's future on Washington's reliability? Or would you start building alternative relationships that give you strategic depth and negotiating leverage? This is exactly the lens through which the Saudi-Iran rapprochement must be understood. It was brokered by China, and that detail is not incidental, it is the entire point. Beijing stepped into a diplomatic role that Washington had historically monopolized, and it succeeded where American diplomacy had failed for decades. It brought two bitter regional rivals to the table and produced a normalization agreement that has largely held. For the Gulf states, this was proof of concept. It demonstrated that China could play a constructive role in their security environment, that the world was genuinely multipolar in a functional rather than merely rhetorical sense, and that they had real options beyond the American orbit. But to understand why this matters at the civilizational level, not just the strategic level, we have to look at something deeper than diplomacy and security arrangements. We have to look at the question of moral authority, because that is what is really being contested here, and it is the dimension that Western analysts almost universally miss. For the better part of the post-Cold War era, American foreign policy operated with an implicit moral mandate: democracy, human rights, the rules-based international order. These were not just rhetorical dressings. They were genuinely believed by much of the world to represent a superior organizing principle for global affairs, and that belief gave American power a legitimacy that extended far beyond raw military and economic strength. Nations followed American leadership not only because they had to, but because many of them genuinely believed the American project represented something worth following. That moral authority has not merely declined. In the eyes of much of the global South, and increasingly in the eyes of the Gulf states themselves, it has been comprehensively destroyed. And the mechanism of its destruction is something that anyone watching events in Gaza over the past 2 years understands viscerally. When the world's self-proclaimed defender of human rights and international law provides unconditional diplomatic and military support for operations that independent UN investigators and international legal bodies have described in terms that strain the boundaries of acceptable discourse, when that happens, the gap between America's stated values and its actual behavior becomes impossible to paper over. For the Gulf states, this is not an abstract geopolitical observation. It is a domestic political reality that shapes what their populations will and will not tolerate their governments doing in alignment with Washington. This is why the Gulf states backing Iran right now is not, at its core, a story about Iran. Iran is the immediate issue, the current flashpoint, but the underlying dynamic is a fundamental reassessment by these governments of where the world is going and which relationships they need to cultivate to navigate that world successfully. They are not becoming anti-American in some ideological sense. Saudi Arabia is not about to close the American military bases on its soil or exit the dollar-denominated oil trading system overnight. These are pragmatic governments, not revolutionary ones. What they are doing is something more sophisticated and ultimately more consequential. They are hedging. They are building a portfolio of relationships with China, with Russia, with Iran, with the emerging BRICS architecture that gives them strategic autonomy they have never historically possessed. And in doing so, they are fundamentally altering the structure of the global order. Now, I want you to sit with a question for a moment, and I genuinely want to hear what you think in the comments, because this is not a rhetorical question. When a region that was the cornerstone of American global power projection for half a century begins actively diversifying away from American patronage, what does that tell us about the trajectory of American power itself? Because the Gulf is not a peripheral region. The Gulf is where the energy that powers the global economy comes from. It is where the financial surpluses that recycle into American treasury markets originate. It is the geographic anchor of American military dominance over Eurasia. Losing influence there is not a setback. It is a structural blow to the entire architecture of American global primacy. And yet Washington's response to this shift has been, to put it plainly, remarkably unimaginative. The instinct has been to double down, more pressure on Iran, more weapons to Israel, more insistence that partners choose sides in a binary framework that increasingly does not reflect the actual geometry of global power. This is the behavior of an institution that has not yet fully internalized the scale of the change happening around it. There is a concept in strategic theory sometimes called the last acre of empire, the tendency of declining powers to fight most ferociously for influence in the very regions they are losing, expending their remaining credibility in battles that only accelerate their strategic retreat. The current American approach to the Middle East has the uncomfortable texture of exactly that dynamic. The Chinese role in all of this deserves more serious attention than it typically receives in Western commentary. Beijing has been extraordinarily disciplined in how it has built its position in the Gulf. It has not sought military dominance, it has not demanded ideological alignment, it has offered infrastructure investment, economic partnership, diplomatic facilitation, and most importantly, a posture of non-interference in domestic political arrangements. For governments that have spent decades navigating the uncomfortable demands of an American patron that constantly entangled security assistance with governance expectations and human rights rhetoric, the Chinese model feels genuinely liberating. This is not naivety on the part of the Gulf states about Chinese intentions. They are sophisticated actors. They simply see the Chinese relationship as offering benefits that the American relationship has been increasingly unable to provide at a political cost that is considerably lower. Russia's position in this equation is also more nuanced than Western coverage suggests. The Ukraine conflict has been framed in Western media almost entirely as a story of Russian aggression versus democratic resistance. But for the Gulf states observing from the outside, the more significant observation has been about Western economic warfare, sanctions, asset freezes, the weaponization of dollar clearing systems, and what that demonstrates about the risks of deep integration with Western financial architecture. If Russian sovereign assets can be frozen, if any nation that sufficiently displeases Washington can be excluded from the global payment system, then the calculus around dollar dependence changes fundamentally. The Gulf states are watching this very carefully, and it is no coincidence that discussions around non-dollar trade settlement mechanisms have accelerated dramatically within both BRICS and Gulf Cooperation Council forums over the same period. This connects to the critical realization I asked you to hold at the beginning, and now is the moment to fully unpack it. The story of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar backing Iran is really a story about the delegitimization of the petrodollar system. The arrangement established in the 1970s, whereby Gulf oil would be priced and traded exclusively in US dollars in exchange for American security guarantees. That arrangement was the foundation of dollar hegemony. It is what allowed America to run persistent trade deficits without the currency collapse that would afflict any other nation doing the same thing. It is what made American financial sanctions effective, because if you need dollars to buy oil, you need access to American financial systems, which gives Washington extraordinary leverage over the entire global economy. But if the Gulf states begin trading oil in yuan, in euros, in a BRIC settlement currency, or in any arrangement that does not require dollar intermediation, then that leverage evaporates, and the fiscal foundations of American global power become significantly more fragile. The Gulf states are not yet ready to make that leap completely or cleanly. There are too many interlocking dependencies, too much institutional inertia, too much domestic wealth stored in dollar-denominated assets, but the direction of movement is unmistakable. Each diplomatic gesture toward Iran, each deepening of the relationship with China, each participation in non-dollar trade experiment is a small brick removed from the wall of dollar hegemony. The wall does not collapse immediately, it weakens gradually, and then at some point the gradient shifts and the collapse becomes rapid. We are not yet at the rapid phase, but we are clearly in the weakening phase, and Washington's response, pressure, sanctions, military posturing, is not reversing that dynamic. If anything, it is accelerating it by continuously reminding Gulf governments why they need alternatives. I want to ask you another question that I find genuinely fascinating. Is there any scenario in which Washington could actually reverse this trend? Because this is where I find the strategic debate most interesting. There are people in American foreign policy circles who believe that a sufficiently coercive approach, maximum pressure on Iran, combined with firm demands that Gulf partners align can restore the old hierarchy. I think that analysis fundamentally misreads the current moment. The Gulf states are no longer in a position of strategic dependence where coercion is decisive. They have options, real options, that they did not have 15 years ago. Trying to bully a partner that has genuine alternatives does not produce compliance. It produces resentment and accelerated hedging. The alternative would require something that American political culture currently seems incapable of producing: a genuine strategic pivot that offers the Gulf states a new value proposition, one built on genuine partnership rather than managed dependence, on economic integration rather than security transactionalism, on respecting their sovereign choices rather than demanding ideological alignment. That kind of pivot would require acknowledging some hard truths about the limits of American power and the failures of American policy over the past 2 decades. It would require the kind of strategic humility that great powers rarely demonstrate until they have no remaining alternative. What we are watching in the Gulf right now is a region making choices about the future of the world order, quietly, pragmatically, without the dramatic declarations that Western media would need to take it seriously. Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Qatar backing Iran is not a headline about Iran. It is a headline about whether the American century extends into a second act or whether we are already, irrevocably, living through its denouement. And the answer to that question matters for every American, not because American dominance is something worth preserving at any cost, but because the transition out of it, if managed badly, carries enormous risks for global stability that affect everyone. The chessboard is being reset. The pieces are moving in ways that the old maps do not accurately describe. And the first step toward understanding what is really happening and what it means for you, for your country, for the world your children will inherit, is to recognize that the story you are being told is, at best, half the story. The other half is what we just walked through together. What you do with it is the most important question of all.